Hello, everyone, and welcome to this installment of NCFS Unbound, our book series on new research, new publications in 19th century French studies. Okay, so I am so pleased to introduce you to, or many of you know already, Jessica Tanner, who is an associate professor of French and Francophone Studies and graduate advisor in French at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And she's going to be talking about her new publication, Sex Work, Text Work, Mapping Prostitution in the 19th Century French Novel, which is hot off the presses with Northwestern University Press. So it's very exciting, and especially exciting for me to, I like to celebrate all books. That's why we're here. We love to celebrate publications for NCFS, but it's especially thrilling to have first-time book authors on our program, on our video. And Jessica's currently working on a second book project on weather, climate, and the politics of distinction in 19th century French literature and culture. And she will be interviewed today by Colin Foss, who is Associate Professor of French at Austin College, north of Dallas, Texas. He is the author of The Culture of War, Literature of the Siege of Paris, 1870 to 1871, recently in paperback with Liverpool University Press, and you can watch his interview on this Zoom series. You can find it on HFrance Salon. He is currently on sabbatical, working on a new book project on homemaking and domestication in the colonial French Empire. Alongside Anne O'Neill Henry, he edits book reviews for 19th century French Studies, the journal. So I am going to turn it over to them now.
Hi, everyone. So I want to begin by thanking the organizers of NCFS Unbound, obviously Rachel, Susan, and Masha, for inviting me to talk about my book today, and more generally for their tireless efforts to create a community that has sustained us and supported our work for a good while now outside of our yearly conference. I also want to thank my wonderful, generous interlocutor, Colin Foss, for agreeing to engage with my work and ideas so thoughtfully, especially during his sabbatical. So thank you for that. I'm also immensely grateful to all of you who've listened to me talk about this project over the years at NCFS, and especially to the colleagues who took the time to read my book and offer thoughtful and generative feedback during the review process. And finally, my sincere thanks to all of you for being here this afternoon. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to talk with you about my work. So, Sex Work, Text Work, Mapping Prostitution in the 19th Century French Novel examines representations of Parisian prostitutes as both historical categories and metaphorized objects in male-authored French realist and naturalist novels from the late 19th century, with a focus on the early Third Republic. In the late 19th century, representing Paris and regulating Paris were analogous projects. In confronting the rapidly evolving capital, literary authors and municipal authorities perceived similar threats and adopted similar strategies to address them. Both turned to working class prostitution, seeking to propagate order in the city at large by demonstratively containing disorder within a singular figure. Situating naturalist fiction in the context of a set of policies known as réglementarisme, reglementarism or regulationism, which tolerated prostitution, quote unquote, but required sex workers to register with the police and submit to mandatory medical examinations. Sex Work, Text Work argues that prostitution provided a map for making sense of modern Paris in the fin de siècle French imaginary. The book begins with a discussion of Balzac's celebrated characterization of Paris and Ferragus as cette grande courtisane, showing how the courtesan allows Balzac to encapsulate all of Paris's social strata and the arrivist's entire narrative trajectory into a singular metaphor. Balzac, of course, left a formidable mark on both the city and the novel, a legacy that would inspire and intimidate his literary successors. In the decades that followed, countless aspiring Rastignacs used the author's novels as a guide for plotting out a path to the city's heights, while aspiring Balzacs sought to make their name by capturing the city in their own fictions. But novelizing Paris during the Second Empire and early Third Republic was an even more daunting task than it had been during the July Monarchy. And though demi-mondaines, courtesans and other demi-mondaines were among the most visible figures in imperial Paris, the city was no longer readily apprehended as a courtesan, accessible to any upstart with sufficient ambition and virile and semantic prowess. So over the course of the second half of the 19th century, pronounced shifts in Paris's built and venal landscapes irrevocably fractured the symbolic equation of city and courtesan. For one, the reconstruction of Paris during the Second Empire profoundly reshaped the city's physical, political, and social topography, making it difficult for even the shrewdest observers to make sense of the capital. At the same time, the city's prostitutional landscape was dramatically changing, as officially regulated prostitution, which had been in place since the beginning of the century, was progressively supplanted by an array of unofficial or so-called clandestine practices and spaces. By the early Third Republic, in other words, both Paris and the prostitute had splintered into an array of sites, signs, and bodies that no longer coalesced into a singular symbol, no matter how masterful the writer who sought to consolidate them in metaphor and in the space of the novel. And yet, in late 19th century Paris, novelists and municipal authorities alike still sought to make sense of the city by mapping prostitution. This brings me to the first of the book's two central claims, that much like administrators, the canonical and so-called minor authors that I study asserted their command over the city by plotting its prostitutes in space and in story, conscripting them into the service of a territorial project. I argue that working class prostitution provided these authors with a spatial and social architecture that they used to impose order on both late 19th century Paris and on the realistic novel. This is not to say that prostitution itself serves as an overarching or monolithic form in naturalist fiction. Rather, I contend that it provides writers with a constellation of spaces, types, and practices that they can use to locate themselves and their plots in the capital, establishing their authority by staking a claim to the prostitute, the city, and the novel itself as literary territory. In seeking to make the city readable and writable at a time when it was perceived to resist representation, the novelists I study reproduce the logic of the municipal authorities who sought to safeguard the social order by mapping prostitution. But the book's second and maybe more provocative claim is that these novels also undermine that disciplinary logic via their circulation to readers, which makes even the clandestine prostitutes that the reglementarist system was designed to obscure indiscriminately visible and accessible. Drawing upon the work of philosophers Jacques Rancière and Michel de Certeau, I demonstrate that the prostitutes in naturalist fiction persistently evade or disrupt the mapping that would locate and confine them in assigned spaces such as the tolerated brothel, the brasserie à femmes, the streets of Paris, and the naturalist novel itself, and thereby claim them as literary territory. Attending to the specificity of each of these spaces, I argue that naturalist prostitutes, quote unquote, write back against their inscription by standing in for readers, preemptively revealing the failure of their authors' efforts to secure prostitutes' narratives as their own literary property. The book is divided into four main chapters, each focused on a literal and conceptual space of Parisian prostitution. So they're listed here: the tolerated brothel or the maison de tolérance, the brasserie à femmes, which is an unregulated space, an unofficial space of prostitution and other practices, the department store, which here serves as an avatar for both the city and the space of the novel itself, and the street. The organization of the chapters follows a loose chronology. I move from the tolerated brothels that were the subject of the earliest novels of prostitution, naturalist novels of prostitution, from the mid to late 1870s, to the various spaces of clandestine prostitution that attracted authorial attention at the turn of the century, when tolerated prostitution was increasingly threatened by changes in consumer demand. This evolution in prostitutional practice unfolds alongside shifts in the way the authors I study map prostitution. I begin with those authors who overtly reinforce the reglementarist structure in order to give shape to the city, and secure their literary mastery. So written in the 1870s, primarily these novels, including Huysmans' Marthe d'Histoire d'une Fille from 1876, and Edmond de Goncourt's La Fille Elisa from 1877, whose representation of the tolerated brothel I analyzed in chapter 1. These novels are oriented towards the past. They're either openly nostalgic, as is the case with La Fille Elisa and Goncourt, or they're protectively commemorating what might yet be saved from a relentless future. I next turn to the authors who in the 1880s seek to domesticate Paris in a way by aligning the novel with spaces of clandestine prostitution. So the woman-staffed beer hall or brasserie à femmes in Alphonse Tabarant's 1886 novel Virus d'amour, Virus of Love, and the department store, a so-called Maison de Tolérance du Commerce that Zola casts as a regulated brasserie of sorts in Au Bonheur des Dames from 1883, fashioning the novel itself as a paradoxical house of prostitution. These novels from the 1880s largely surrender the promised security of the Maison Fermée or Maison de Tolérance in exchange for a space that can accommodate art and literary invention, along with mimetic representation and literary authority. And then finally, in chapter 4, I move forward to 1901 and to a novelist who identifies with the clandestine street prostitute, analyzing how the working class novelist Charles Philippe's Pupille de Montparnasse reconfigures the dominant order of perception by embracing a vision of the novel itself as a space where anyone, including those like clandestine prostitutes in the street, who have no recognized place in the city or in society, can speak and act out of turn. Ultimately, my book shows the mapping of prostitution exposed the borders that governed legal and social legitimacy in 19th century Paris, because the regulation of prostitution was one of the primary strategies that was used to plot and to police those borders. As such, it made the novel itself a space where those borders could be reconfigured. And along with them, the dominant logic of perception and social inclusion that Rancière calls the partage du sensible. So in light of this, the conclusion of Sex Work, Text Work explores the political implications of the book's literary analysis by identifying how prostitution is more generally recruited to establish and reinforce borders, relating 19th century French prostitution and its fictions to the history of French colonialism, as well as current debates about the regulation of prostitution, from legalization to the criminalization of solicitation, to the potential restoration of the system of tolerated brothels, as well as the regulation of immigration. So I want to just draw on two quotes here from Harsha Walia's recent book, Border and Rule from 2021, that help to kind of get at what I mean about prostitution and the making of space, the making of borders. The first is that most maps do not conceptualize the shifting cartography of borders. And the implication being here that prostitution, prostitutes as mobile bodies, tend to be conscripted in the service of plotting out borders that can't be seen on maps in this sense. And the second Walia quote is this one: borders are not fixed lines or passive objects simply demarcating territory. Borders are productive regimes, both generated by and reproducing racialized social relations, further imbued by gender, sexuality, class, ability, and nationality. So my conclusion following along these lines uncovers how the prostitute's body has historically been endowed with the capacity to make subjective and geopolitical space and delineate community by mapping borders. It investigates what Romans de Filles from the early Third Republic can tell us about prostitution's continued role in mapping anxieties about France's place in the world. Both in the 19th century and today, I propose concerns about the prostitute's place are fundamentally entwined with anxieties about immigration, national identity, and the tolerance of difference. In closing, my conclusion turns to explore the broader stakes of the book's arguments with respect to the politics of reading. Bringing biopolitical thinkers like Roberto Esposito and Donna Haraway into conversation with Rancière, I take the 19th century French novel of prostitution as a model for exploring the novel's potential to disrupt border making and create what Esposito terms an affirmative community, a radically inclusive form of collective established here through the novel's indiscriminate circulation. Ultimately, I argue even those novels of prostitution that most explicitly align with the regulatory logic of municipal administrators make space for a distinctly literary form of resistance via their distribution to readers. The novel resistance I identify in the book is neither sovereign nor determinate. Where it emerges, it does so in the time of reading and in tandem with the reader. The resistance of characters, in other words, is the work of readers, and particularly as I show through a discussion of later works by women, including Berthe Leroy, Germaine Aziz, and Virginie Despentes, of sex workers themselves as readers. It is a singularity, this resistance, one of the novel's many latent futures, potential energy contained in the character of the prostitute, that any reader may activate as they negotiate the text. And so that's a bit of a map to the book. And with that, I will turn it over to Colin.
Yeah, we can. Okay. Thank you so much for that. So yeah, I'm Colin Foss. I'll be kind of leading the discussion here about your really wonderful, fascinating, and I think very urgent, important book. I wrote to you a few days ago about this, saying that this is the book I wish I had in grad school, because it just puts so many pieces together that that had so far been separate. And thank you so much for your presentation about this too. You speak a lot about novels that everyone in this room, this virtual room, will know, by Les Goncourt, Zola, Huysmans, etc. But you present a lot of other texts that may not be as well known, texts that may not be in publication anymore. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about how you chose your corpus of texts. And if you have the time as well to maybe speak about a text that we may not know about, but that you want to highlight.
Sure. First of all, thank you for those overly generous, kind comments about the book. I really appreciate it, and I'm so grateful to have you as an interlocutor today. The corpus question. There's a couple of different factors in how I chose it. One is the project itself was kind of generated over a drink in grad school with François Proulx, who I think is here. He was working on Les Déracinés by Maurice Barras and talking about the fact that he noticed that there were spatial categories of prostitution that were at work in that book. And so from that, I sort of started to look in Artful, in Gallica, and other sorts of digital archives to sort of see where what types of spaces of prostitution, the ones Alain Corbin talks about, for instance, in Les Filles de Noces, what types of spaces of prostitution showed up in what kinds of fictions, and how often they occurred relative to each other and things like this. In very good timing, there was also a recueil that was published, Robert Laffont volume, published by Daniel Krojnowski and Mireille Dautin-Orsini, I believe, called Un Joli Monde, that was published right as I was trying to sort of gather texts for the project. And that made available texts that hadn't been available in a long time, including one of the minor texts I think is possibly the most memorable, that I talk about the most, which is Virus d'amour, the Virus of Love, by Adolphe Tabarrant from 1883. So that was extremely helpful to have access to these texts and to make them sort of more publicly available as well, to texts that were not as well known, hadn't been written about as much. In the end, I think I started to see the combination of looking at canonical works and more sort of unknown, lesser known, minor so-called works as really in keeping with what the book was trying to do. And there's a couple pieces of that as well. One is that I'm really focused on working class prostitution, as opposed to sort of more focusing on courtesans who had made a name for themselves largely as a condition to sort of, that was part of the process of becoming a demi-mondaine, like one of the Paris's great demi-mondaine, and particularly the ones who wrote their own memoirs, wrote their own novels, which have been, really skillfully analyzed by Rachel, by Courtney Sullivan, by Carol Mossman, and others in other texts. So I was interested in looking at books where that were really about working class prostitution, which tends to be kind of reduced to an anonymous horde in the treatises from the time and in some novels as well, because novels endow them with or recognize that they have a face in a story. And there's something about the play with the minor and the major authors as well that I think works in the same way. So you have an author like Charles Philippe in Bubu de Montparnasse, which I mentioned. I talk about in chapter 4 on the street. That novel was quite well known when it was released. I mean, it was Francois Gide who talks about it. T.S. Eliot wrote the introduction to the English translation, but then kind of, got forgotten. But this is a working class author trying to make his place. And that's very much the thematization of the book itself, is how can someone who doesn't have a place or a voice in Paris or on the literary landscape make a place in the novel? And it's via prostitution most often, I think, that happens. So that's sort of a long meandering answer to your question, but there are both just kind of circumstantial factors that help me pick my corpus, and a lot of searching for different terms. And then really starting to see, there weren't very many books written about the brasserie à femme, and I analyzed why in my chapter on the brasserie, um, as it poses some kind of a threat to literary mastery, in a sense, versus, lots of spaces like the brothel or that, which, have a lot of representation, but mostly in provincial spaces. That kind of search helped me really figure out what I was trying to say.
Yeah, actually, just this the brasserie à femme is a really interesting thing that you bring up that at least maybe naively I had never really thought of before, never really heard of before. Can you give us like just a brief kind of
Yeah.
introduction to this and say how it's important for your book?
Yeah. So these were still, despite the fact that the difference basically between this and other traditional, what we think of as a brasserie in time, um, is they're stopped by women, who are, at least conflated with prostitutes, not always actually practicing in prostitution, which, is very often the case. That women who are figured in the popular imaginary as sex workers may not actually be participating in any kind of sex work at all. It's still a space of male sociability. In a fundamental way. But it's kind of a space, they're reputed to, and the danger of the brasserie à femme in the eyes of administrators and moralists and hygienists is both that it's clandestine, it's unregulated, and also its popularity with young men, bacheliers, with students, and they were mostly in the Latin Quarter, was where they were primarily located, particularly in the early years, in the late 1870s and 1880s, which was sort of the high point. But the whole thing that was for sale there was basically a plot, a vision of the client as a protagonist, right? It was a story of seduction. And so I use a scene from Au Rebours by Huysmans to get into this in the chapter I devote to the brasserie, where he identifies the brasserie à femme as basically symbolic of the entire time period. And in a very derogatory way, but where these young men come, desperate for connection in many cases, desperate to sort of try to see themselves as young Rastignac, as Barras points out, that they're coming looking for connection, but in a sense to their future selves. They're looking for to be sold a plot of desire that they're actually the brasserie worker's job is to try to convince them or sell them a story in which they're actually seducing the woman who's waiting on them and is just, there obviously to sell them beer, which is her job. So it's trading in fictions as much as it is trading in beer. And I think that selling stories bit of the brasserie à femme makes that a little bit more difficult maybe to grapple with in narrative, and possibly more interesting in some ways to grapple with in narrative. And definitely was part of what was seen as a threat by administrators, because they were really, thought to be capable of not only contaminating young men with venereal disease, and stoking all kinds of other anxieties in the wake of the Franco-Prussian War, but also of really throwing them off course by uprooting their narrative course, I suppose.
It might be a strange question. Thank you so much. There might be a strange question, but I mean, like I'm now that I live in the American suburbs, Hooters.
Yeah, I mean,
are these? Do you think that these might be in the same lineage as this?
yeah, I mean, that's actually really, I can't believe that question actually has not come up before. And I can't believe I actually have never made that connection. So thank you for that.
Yeah,
I don't know if we can find a way to actually like do some kind of NCFS panel where we, I don't know, trace the lineage between brasseries and Hooters, but I do think it's actually is in Chris McCready. Yeah, I think that's actually completely accurate in so many ways about if we think about sort of what, yeah, they're definitely the ancestors of yeah, an unlikely one, but apparently one with actually like an analytical basis. Yeah, I think that's a really apt analogy and comparison.
Well, I mean, I'm just thinking too, like, even just in, traditional kind of tip-based cultures, or, there's, that's a part of the kind of the capitalist system we're living in, I guess. I wanted to ask about the methodology of your book, which I really appreciate, and I think a lot of us here today really appreciate, where it's sort of historical and literary, and specifically in the way that you encountered the body. You see the body and you take it as a metaphorical object, as a literary object, and as a sort of biological object. And so, for example, in your analysis of the roman de filles, and elsewhere, kind of all throughout your book, The prostitute's body is used as a way of kind of imagining Paris, as a way of imagining political space. Can you say more about how the body for you, how it can carry all of these meanings? Because I mean, again, you're also very keen to point out that these bodies we're talking about are real bodies.
Yeah.
Can you say more about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. And one that, I think there's some places I wish I could have grappled with a little bit more openly in the book. But I think that part of it is that these bodies, the way that I'm addressing them as both real bodies and as, bodies imbued with metaphorical import, or capacity, I guess, is echoing what not only, I mean, it's obviously what I'm arguing that novelists are doing with representation of prostitutes, but it's also echoing what administrators did with prostitution, which is to make these women, who are definitely seen as vehicles of literal contagion, contamination, venereal disease, right? But also the sort of metaphorical seminal sewer, et cetera, in Parents du Châtelet and other hygienic and moralist treatises. They're always kind of about doing both or representing both, right? These were real women, but they were also invested with this metaphorical both I don't know, menace, threat, and also capacity for carrying meaning, for bearing meaning more generally. And this is what I'm getting at when I talk about borders, I think, in this sense, is that they're really kind of both portrayed in fiction, but also portrayed in administrative policies and texts and treatises as having the capacity to institute an order that is then able to be propagated to society at large. And this was not a successful effort in so many ways, right? I mean, there were always as many thinkers from the time pointed out, as I mentioned in my book's introduction, the very creation of the system of tolerated prostitution, of reglementarism, creates this category of women who escape that label by creating the idea of the insoumise, right? The disobedient prostitute, the one who's not subjected to this kind of spacing. So it's always a fiction in that sense. But the idea is that individual prostitutes are registered and tracked either into tolerated brothels, or they're confined to very specific conditions and limitations on their practice in the streets. And then they're subjected to hygienic checks, right, for venereal disease, the visite sanitaire. So that they're trying to instill this through operations on the individual body that are then made to represent something broader, both to contain a literal threat and to contain a metaphorical threat of disorder. This is what Foucault talks about as a useful delinquency, right? Making them docile bodies that are conscripted in the service of a bigger project. So all that said, I think the other piece of this for me is the question about real women. That in a book that's really focused on literary representation is something I've grappled with a lot, because we don't have a lot of access to the words of working class prostitutes in general, except in police archives and things like this. Sometimes they make it to us. So part of this is also an attempt to kind of grasp it, how we might always keep that part of it in mind when looking at representation, that these were real women with real bodies, that they were being invested with symbolic significance by authors, by administrators, and to be fair, by my own book. I mean, there's no way to sort of escape that paradigm. So yeah.
Isn't that, I mean, it feels like this is like a lot of meaning in one thing. You know what I mean? Like it feels like it's kind of bursting with this. I mean, it's a little bit too much to put into people who you rightly say, don't really have much agency, even within the text that you're reading. We have a question from the chat that I might bring up.
Sure.
Hannah writes, such an exciting, thought-provoking book. We all agree. I was hoping you could say a little more about why Haussmannization, which could be seen as creating coherent, meaning authoritarian aesthetic for the city, was experienced by novelists as a fragmentation of the city, something that made it harder to represent. And Hannah, I completely agree with you about this.
Mm-hmm.
You kind of subvert the normal way that we talk about housemanization, which is about rationalization.
Yeah, of
And
course.
yet you say, no, this made incoherent narratives. It splintered, I think is the word that you used. And what a great question. And I wonder if you have anything to say about that.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much, Hannah, for that question. I'm delighted also to have you as an interlocutor and a huge fan of your work, as I think you know. But it's a great question. This is something that really has been one of those pieces that I've grappled with over time as well. But the first sort of thing that I noticed was thinking, along the lines of something like Baudelaires Le Cygne, and talking about how disruptive it can be to have a space that's in process, that has changed so quickly, can be disorienting for a viewer. Thinking about things like, I don't actually really talk about this much in the book, very briefly in the Zola chapter, but in Une Page d'Amour, for instance, in the panoramas of Paris in that novel, Zola ends up sort of being anachronistic and putting things in different times together to weave together the Parisian landscape that he wants to create. So if you take naturalist theory, particularly at its word, which is always needs to be done with a caveat, because I think in many cases obviously Zola's novels are more interesting when he portrays them to be in his theoretical text. The idea is to be able to représenter la vie telle qu'elle est, represent everything as it is, an exact slice of life, mimetic representation of the real. So I started kind of from the idea that there was something about this that resisted mimetic representation, looking at the journalists from the time like Victor Fournel, Fourier, not Fourier, I forget his name right now, Fournel and the other one that I talked about at the beginning, that are talking about how it's very difficult to catalog even the changes that are happening to Paris, because the hammer moves faster than the pen. So that by the time you actually can capture something in narrative, it's no longer of its time. I also play with the idea that it's really difficult in the moment where these processes are still very visibly taking place, including after Haussmann was no longer the prefect, things like the opera, obviously, which was finished in the Third Republic, that there's still a sense that, you have to wait until the process is complete to be able to represent something that's going to be actually sustainable in narrative. So that's a question about narrative time, I guess, about what is actually able to be captured in narrative in a way that's still going to feel contemporary, that's still going to feel of one cohesive time. The other piece of it I think is really important is that Haussmannization is seen as antithetical to literary creation. The very rationalization that you both mentioned, the idea that that it is really based on creating this authoritarian, coherent aesthetic for the city, is experienced also obviously as something that's hostile to literary interest. That you can no longer have the sort of detours that Balzac has his characters go through in arrivistes that are trying to climb the city. They would just be a straight up and down climb. There's no metonymy, as to go back to reading for the plot, Peter Brook's character, just metaphor, and that you lose the sort of plot in that metaphorization. So there's that, Edmond de Goncourt, both Goncourt brothers, different versions of that famous quote that T.J. Clarke analyzes as well, about Notre Paris, le Paris de, there's different versions, s'en va, l'intérieur s'en va, or whatever, talking about there's all, it's all ligne droite, there's no sort of, there's no turns, there's no twists and turns, everything else, it's hostile to, the twists and turns you need for narrative. And so it's about trying to, in my reading, it's about trying to represent the city as it is, while reinvesting it with the history and narrative interest that Haussmannization deprives it of, in a sense, because it really is an erasure of history in so many ways, Haussmannization as well, and they need to sort of reinscribe that history to give it literary interest, I guess. And so this is what I look at in La Fille Elisa, for instance, by Goncourt, where he excavates literally letters and things from the and a guidebook by Béraud, a treatise on prostitution from the 1830s, to talk about prostitution during the Second Empire or early Third Republic. It's literally excavating part of the city's past to give it back that, graft that literary interest back into it. But it ends up being a sort of an uncanny equilibrium that's hard to sustain. So I don't know if that completely answers your question, but it's a great question and a really key one, I think, for my discussion of the city and the novel. Thank you.
I think, Hannah, like I completely agree with you with that question. And then it makes me think that, we have spilled a lot of ink talking about Haussmannization, and yet, as you say, it kind of resists this representation within literature at the time. Yeah. Francois Prou has a great question, which also aligns with something I was going to ask you too. He writes, can you say a bit more about the really exciting argument about reading and writing you make in the second part of your book? And I think this is one of your main arguments about how represented sex workers, quote, resist plotting by writers who try to use them to assert narrative symbolic mastery, but also how they can represent a mode of freedom or resistance for readers, both in the 19th century and later on, even today. And again, this is something I've been thinking about when I was reading your book, about the idea of writing back, which is a really interesting question that you also kind of, I mean, maybe you don't have time in this answer right now, but goes into the colonies as well, but maybe that's a different.
That's a huge question I wish I would have been able to take on more directly and more than just the conclusion. I came too late, I think, in the process. The conclusion was the newest part of the book that did not exist at all in its former iteration. So yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Francois. Thank you, Colin, for that. And it's something that I've grappled with so much. It took me a long time to figure out what I meant by talking about this kind of resistance. As I think Janet could also tell you. Yeah, it took me a long time to figure out what I was trying to say. And one of the key pieces of this, I think, is, again, the desire to focus on working class prostitution. It makes it, there have been wonderful analyses already done of writing by courtesans, and I wanted to look and see if there was something more to the representation of different types of prostitutes in male-authored naturalist fiction, beyond just the sort of phantasmatic assertion of mastery, like Bernheimer analyzes so masterfully in Figures of Ill Repute, for instance. And so I started to see that, the very things that stoke the fears of observers at the time, administrators and writers, the treatises and things, are the same things that are kind of like the pressure points for types of resistance in the novels I analyze. So it is the brasserie prostitute's ability to spin story that ends up leading her to get evicted from the brasserie in the novel that I talk about, by Tabaron, and ends up, of course, unsurprisingly in these fictions, dying a terrible death of syphilis. It's called Virus d'amour. As one of the few people who had written about it before I started reading it, says it's basically a novel that extends over 300 pages. The last scene of Nana, sort of decomposing of, but I kind of take that decomposing literally, I guess, in a sense, and look at ways in which there are moments in that novel toward the end where, she cries out, "À moi, à moi, à moi," as she's dying. And yes, of course, it's like, "Help me." But it also is this moment that kind of interpolates the reader in an indirect way. They kind of escapes the closed temporality of the narrative that's trying to confine her in her death. Bibi de Montparnasse is a more sort of radical version of this, I guess, and the novel that I use the most to talk about this kind of dynamic. Then that novel, he is sort of tempted to, there's really a question, it's really organized around this dichotomy between the protagonist, who's really just a generic dude, like, that has no real assets, character of his own, right? His name is Pierre Aldi. He's very generic protagonist. In so many ways, it's kind of like a vacant character space, but similar to Philippe himself in terms of his characteristics, against the pimp, who is fighting him. He's basically fighting the pimp for the affections of this clandestine street prostitute, Berthe Métainier. And in that novel, there's a temptation expressed on the part of the narrator, of the protagonist, and indirectly, I think, from Philippe himself, who expresses this in his letters, to identify with the pimp as a powerful figure who's basically like the underworld arriviste, in a sense. He's the one that takes over from the arriviste trajectory. But to do that, he literalizes all of the sort of subjugation that happens of the prostitute in the process, by being with violence, and all the different mechanisms of control that are activated. So what I argue in that case, and this is trying to get back to the actual question about resistance and writing back, is that at the end of that novel, there's an earlier scene where he's basically told by a friend who's been through this before, you need to save this woman from her pimp. And the end of the novel repeats that scene basically, and he does not save her. but instead he changes what was originally something in the first person, like I should have saved her, I should have done this, I should have done this, from his friend, to something that's in the second person. Tu aurais dû la sauver, tu aurais dû descendre. And that sort of switch to the second person creates this weird space where you feel like you really do feel called upon as a reader. And a resistance to trying to, like, to the savior narrative, right? Of trying to intercede for good, for better, or for worse, right? This is not obviously just a good thing, but it is something that's a different choice, and that he writes about in his letters later, because the woman on whom that prostitute character is based ended up getting a copy of his book that found her in the south of France, or in, I don't remember, I think she was already in the south of France, and I talk about this in the conclusion. She found the book and then ended up getting back in touch with him on the basis of recognizing herself in his book as a reader, who then came back and had already got his help then to more durably get away from her pimp, but of her own accord. So I look at these kinds of things largely in a desire to try to see, to kind of break the equation between writing and resistance. I think we have a tendency to overinvest the capacity of writing to represent resistance, and to underinvest reading with the capacity to represent agency or resistance. And so it's not, the same kind of agency necessarily as a courtesan who writes and publishes her own memoirs or a novel and reappropriates her story in her own name. But I don't think that just the fact that these women didn't have access to publication, largely, working class prostitutes did not, for several reasons. One, they lacked the kind of individuation that is branding, basically, that allowed courtesans to publish their narratives. But it didn't mean that they didn't resist or they didn't have agency. And I wanted to sort of be really careful to try to recognize that without being, it's unavoidably complicit with the novelists that map them, that I analyze, but still sort of trying to see what readers can do. And that's the basis for trying to theorize this idea that, that readers do make meaning, that readers do things with books, and that we can find in them, the sort of stuff of resistance to the way that things are, because they make visible and mobilize these paradigms, regimes of perception. The problem is you can't control how people read. So you can't necessarily determine that those are good politics, but you can perhaps at least have a scene of politics in Rancière's sense. I will shut up now because there's other questions. But
yeah. The chat's going wild. I love this, because you begin, and I think in your introduction, or maybe your first chapter, you talk about the à nous deux, the Rastignac moment, looking down upon Paris, and I really like the à moi as being a corollary to that has much more like kind of interesting complications to it than the à nous deux.
I mean, I think that there's the one little piece that I should have added in an earlier response, I think, and I'll keep it brief again because there's other questions, but is that there's so many traces of Balzac in these fictions. There's so many traces of Rastignac and other Balzacian vis in these fictions. And part of the problem, thank you, David. Part of the problem is that these men are also these authors are trying to make their name. And so they are trying to avoid, just writing the city as Balzac did it, which is not, so it's a sort of a territorial project, and so they need to try to make it anew. Zola is really worried about this, right? To try to clear the ground somehow, make it write the city as it is while making it his own. And it's that kind of project that I think, because like Balzac is one scholar has put it, il avait presque épuisé le sujet avant lui. What is there left to say? How can you make it your own? So that's part of the process as well. That à moi that I look at.
Yeah, let's move to some of these amazing questions that are coming up in the chat here. Marnie Kessler writes, building upon Hannah's great question and Jessica's great response, I wonder whether the mess created by housemanization itself, the massive piles of dirt and debris, the sense of disorder engendered by them, and the ways in which excavation and construction sites made it harder to traverse the city, even as parts were becoming more traversable, also created a space for the exploration of these various forms of subversion, which is a really great question. Do you have any thoughts?
That is a really great question. I do, and I don't have a great answer, probably, definitely that doesn't do justice to that question, which is brilliant, I think. And I love the visual, the sort of the visual art of Marty's language always, and Kristen's as well. I think it's a great sort of pairing of questions. Yeah, that's a really great question. I haven't thought enough about it. But you're absolutely right that a big part of the sort of, I don't know, resistance to some kind of cohesive aesthetic portrait of the city that's not touring is the fact that there are these piles of dirt and debris. The thing that comes to mind, and the thing that I want to think about more, to think with your question, is that it really is the substance of Goncourt's novel, for instance, La Fille Elisa. I mean, he takes parts of it from Baron du Châtelet, as so many novelists did, he based so much of it on Baron du Châtelet, and also Béraud, again, this treatise from the 1830s. But also quite literally a letter that was found and brought to him by someone of his acquaintance. He talks about in the journal, that was actually found in the décombres, as he says, of an area. I can't remember where it is right this second. It's in the book. I wish I remembered the detail, but in one of the sort of ruins of the construction. And there is this sort of idea of the city as a chantier, as an endless construction site. But I really like thinking, this idea about the actual piles of dirt and debris, and how that disrupts literally communication, but literally and metaphorically disrupts communication. So I need to think about that more. But thank you so much for that very generative question. And I want to talk with you about your ideas because I want to think about art too with this. And just to add on, because Kristen was adding on to Marnie's question.
Good. Yeah, I love this question.
I do too. About the pissoir pissotière, the containment of bodily mess and illicit sexuality is super interesting, obviously. Andrew Israel Ross has a good discussion of this sort of Vespasienne and all the sort of the kind of public urination side of Osmanization in the beginning of public city, public sex. But in Virus d'Amour, for instance, like at one point the text almost dissolves into bodily fluids, right? So there's the scene where she gets kicked out of the brasserie. Basically, everything that has been story ends up getting expressed through bodily fluids. So where she was before telling stories, spinning stories, she's now sort of like basically spilling like vomit and ink and urine and everything else. It's just it is absolutely like there's some weird continuum that's happening between spinning story and mess. That's kind of I'm not quite sure how to read that in context of the actual question of what this is in the city, but I really, again, these are great generative questions that I want to think about more. So thank you for both of those.
I think I'm sorry, everyone. We only have about 8 minutes left, but we can stay for maybe a little bit longer. Jessica,
I'm happy to stay in chat if anyone wants to stay in chat.
But Ryan Pilcher has a really good question here about bringing up this idea that you get to in the conclusion, but I think kind of haunts the book, which is about the colonies and how this how your approach to prostitution, to borders, I think, especially the idea of, I love the idea that you frame it not as just maps, but as borders. And I think that really helps us with this question that I'm about to read right now. A question about the colonies, colonization. Given that the Third Republic is a time of colonial expansion, and given what we know or do not know about sex work in the colonies, but since it came late in the process, I think I would just like to hear more about what is said in the conclusion about colonies, colonization, or perhaps about race and sex work, if it's present in the project. And that's a great question, because we kind of assume that there's a whiteness to all these characters that we read about, but
yeah,
it's not true.
I mean, for the most part, in the metropolitan novels that I'm analyzing, yeah, they mostly are. Not always. There are exceptions, and actual brothels, especially toward the end of the century, when you had most of the tolerated brothels and even some unregistered brothels that were left were sort of upper class, grande tolérance, for instance, and they had these salons de choix, where women would sort of array themselves, and the whole idea was that there was an array of types of women with different color hair, different color skin, different race, different ethnicity, different origins, on offer, so that this became part of the sort of selection process for clients, and the solicitation process for the women. Maupassant writes about this in a sort of very body play that is not very known. There are other representations of it. So there are representations in metropolitan fiction of the question of race. Certainly also the way that racialized, the Jewishness racialized gets represented in Balzac, for instance. Maury has a great article about that as well. But I don't talk about it as much as I would want to in the body of the book itself, because I am, again, just there's a fundamental discomfort I have, obviously, with the sort of corpus and focus in terms of really, writing about men, writing about white men, writing about white women largely in the book. But as I sort of really started to understand what I meant by mapping, and what I really started to see about borders, and the fact that these anxieties about prostitution almost always surface in French culture, and not just in French culture, but in French culture at the same time as anxieties about the regulation of immigration, about borders. And also reading the work of the contemporary current sex workers and sex work scholars that have talked about, that things tend to happen if you want to know what to be afraid of happening in terms of like sort of fascism, look to what is done to sex workers first, just like is done to immigrants, because these are populations that are made other, that are labeled, that are made illegal in the case of immigrants, and often in the case of sex workers, obviously, in ways that announce, I guess, that anticipate other kinds of draconian measures that are coming for everyone. But I do talk about I wish I could give you a better, sort of more specific. I actually opened my own book for the first time in a while. I talk about both the a little bit about the Franco-Prussian War and sort of how this is imbricated with colonization. I talk about Christelle Tarot's work a bit, obviously, which is really foundational in talking about prostitution in the colonies, and sort of trace this back up through things like the Loi Sarkozy and Sarkozy's discourses on prostitution and things like this. But I also talk about, for instance, Jamel Aziz in Les Chambres Closes, who talks about, the first part of the book is devoted to her time as in a brothel in Algeria before she came to Paris. I focus more on the part in Paris, but it's sort of along the lines of the same discussion of what's happening. I use Eliza Kamisholi, I don't know how to say her name, work on how the construction of French national identity in the Third Republic and after depends on a gendered and racialized logic, and Laura Stoller's work on sort of putting race back into Foucault's work on biopolitics, for instance. These are the kinds of sort of interlocutors I have here, but it's really about how there was a quite literal exportation of like the same regulation of prostitution to the colonies. So you'll have just like there was a translation of Osmanization in many cases as techniques of social ordering, right, of control, of policing. But also I think that again, this sort of both quite literally and metaphorically, that this is a question of borders. That again, I do address the fair amount in the conclusion, but I think to do more justice, I need to do more justice to. I would have liked to have done even more justice to. I would love to talk with you more about at some point. Thank you for your question. It's a really important one. There's time for one more. Are there one more? Oh, male prostitutes. Yes, this is the other quick question.
Oh, yeah. No.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'll read the question. We can all read it. I'll read it off.
Go for it.
A fascinating discussion of working class female prostitutes. I'd love to hear if you've come across discussion or depictions of male prostitutes and how these might intersect with the issues and configurations you're outlining, which again, I mean, I'm also thinking about like queerness. How does this enter into this?
That's a really important question. Yeah. The two questions I used to always get when I first did even the dissertation phase of this project were why not women? Why are you not working on women authors? And what about queer prostitutes, for instance? And those are both really crucial questions that helped me really think through the project to try to figure out the answers, obviously, because they were not willful exclusions. I do think, Régis Revenant, I believe, is his name, has done a really great work on representations of queer prostitution, especially queer men, and as is Andrew Israel Ross. So I don't address this very much at all in the book, if at all, but in part because really this, I'm kind of looking at the question of how administrators, moralists, hygienists, and novelists are representing the specific configurations and spaces of prostitution, and that in those particular spaces and these particular kinds of texts, the concern is largely with women, but there is still a question about queerness, both in terms of These are thought to be spaces where that generate queerness among women, that favorize, that's not an English word, that encourage encourage women, lesbianism, queerness among women that are spending time in the brothel during the day, for instance, or in the atelier, just by being spaces of female sociability, because they're not always spaces just exclusively of solicitation by male clients. But there's also, the part I do address even more in the book is really the homosociality kind of component of, for instance, the brasserie à femme, of how this is really a space for, still a space of male sociability, even though it's via the prostitute, which is so often the case, I think, in these fictions and in the society itself.
I think
it's a very cursory answer, I'm sorry, but there's it's a really important question.
Well, I think that, Cecilia, I may have co-opted part of your question too, because I think that you were asking maybe not about queerness, but about like heterosexual, like male prostitutes as well.
Oh, right. I'm sorry. Yeah.
No, that was my fault.
On the one. Yeah, no, that I just didn't come across very much, I guess. I mean, that's not to say that it didn't exist. It's definitely quite possibly entirely my own research lacuna. But I guess I was, because I was starting with this corpus of largely naturalist novels, The Prostitution, and looking pretty extensively at what naturalist novels of prostitution have at least made it to us in ways that I can find. That just wasn't something that came up a lot in those particular texts. I think that if you look at a different corpus, that there might be that might be more of a question. The closest you get really is just the pimp as a figure that becomes increasingly important in the early 1900s, both in literature and in fiction, like in Jean Laurent's La Maison Philibert, for instance, which I talk briefly about in the book. But that's not the same thing, obviously. So it's a great question. I want to, makes me want to explore it more. But I don't have a great answer. I'm sorry.
My dear friends, we're at the end of the hour, and so I just want to. We can stay for a little bit, I think, to have more conversation. But I'm
happy to stay if anyone wants to chat. Yes, thank you so much to everybody. Really grateful to all of you for your time and generous questions and thoughtful questions. Give me a lot to think about. A project that I've already thought a lot about for a long time. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you both. You guys are just, I felt like I was watching a talk show. Really an exciting conversation, an exciting accomplishment. And you can tell just by the richness and depth of the questions how generative your book is and how excited everyone is to continue to think with you and through you. So thank you.